the mass deportation of millions of unelected federal bureaucrats out of the DC bureaucracy. And I do think that is what's going to save this country
But you
in the long
can't
run.
do that.
I think you actually can.
You can't fire. We can all be fired. I've been fired many times.
Yeah.
I'm sure you just lost a presidential race. Like we've all, the only group that cannot fail that has actual tenure is not Harvard professors.
Not even. Yep.
It's not even.
Yeah.
It's federal bureaucrats. No, Amy Wax just got, tenure is no protection at all compared to the protection of federal employment.
Yeah. So the one difference is, first of all, we have a president who I think has the spine to actually step up and do it. But the second thing is we actually have and not to get too, in the weeds here, but we actually have a legal landscape with the current Supreme Court that allows us to do what couldn't have been done in the last half century.
But they have a moral right to work from home 10 hours a week at our expense at a far higher wage than the average American.
Oh, absolutely. So the funny thing is,
but they have a moral right. You can't complain about it.
You actually brought up a really interesting dimension of this. If you literally just mandated that they have to actually show up to work Monday through Friday, I know, radical idea.
They don't go to work.
Actually, a good number of them would quit that way. Right. That step alone. So you don't even have to talk about, you want a mass firing, a mass exodus. Just tell them they have to come back 5 days a week from 8 p.m. to 6 p.m. Like many Americans, most Americans who work hard to earn a living in this country, just show up physically to work. You'd actually have about a 25% thinning out of the federal bureaucracy right there. So that's an easy first step. Next step is, so the Supreme Court, what they've laid out right now is they've basically said, in so many words, that most federal regulations are unconstitutional. Close to in so many words, that's what they've said. If Congress didn't pass it, right? So basic principle here is the people we elect to run the government should run the government. That's not the case today. The people who write most of the rules were never elected to their positions.
And the Congress makes the laws. That's what the Constitution says.
That's what the Constitution says, but that's not exactly how it works today. And the Supreme Court, thankfully, has had a major problem with that. So there was this case, West Virginia versus EPA 2 years ago. There was this Loper-Bright case that came down this year that overturned this horrific doctrine called Chevron deference, which said that the courts have to defer to the agency's judgments on what the law actually says. The Supreme Court's torn all of that to shreds. And basically what they've said is, if it's a major question, if it's something that affects people's lives economically or relates to a major political issue, it cannot be written into existence by somebody who is not elected to office or who can't be voted out of office. It has to be done by the people who were elected to write the laws. So who could be voted out if they write bad laws? That's a beautiful thing. And I think that those were seismic in their impact.
You're describing democracy.
That's actually the essence of democracy. That's the essence of self-governance. So we've had those cases come down under this Biden-Harris tenure. But actually, if you have somebody who takes over in the presidency now, as we're going to on January 20th, who takes a posture of executive humility, and this is the key part, right? Because people will say, oh, Donald Trump's going to go, if he's going to go shut down these agencies, that's executive fiat. No, you got it mixed up. The executive fiat's what's been happening for the last century, really, in this country, but over the last 4 years included, unelected bureaucrats by fiat legislating what otherwise should have gone through we the people and our elected representatives. So the Supreme Court's already told the executive branch, no, you can't do that. Actually, a lot of that was illegal and unconstitutional. All we need right now is an executive branch that says, hey, the Supreme Court, you've told us a lot of what we're doing is illegal. It violates the Constitution. So we're not going to do that anymore. And that requires us to take any regulation, any federal regulation that fails these standards that the Supreme Court has given us in West Virginia versus EPA, in Loper-Bright, and there's another case called Jarkissi versus SEC. That one relates to slightly different issues. But the Supreme Court standards, all of these regulations that fail that test, we're just going to rescind them. They're null and void. And we don't have to rescind them because we already know they're actually null and void and illegitimate anyway. But we will put the public on notice to say these tens of thousands of regulations that have been written by federal bureaucrats, they're null and void because they were never written by the people who we elected. Now, if you have 50% fewer regulations, that creates kind of an industrial logic to say that, okay, well, then we don't need 50% of the people around anymore either. And the way these rules have worked in the past is they have this, you know this well, right? The civil service rules, the civil protection rules that say you can't fire these federal bureaucrats. That's been the historical, accepted dogma. Actually, if you read the law carefully, it doesn't work quite that way. That applies to individual firings, right? To say if I fire you, you have a special protection to say that I either politically discriminated against you or discriminated for some other reason, or if you fire a bunch of people with discretionary firings, if there's a disparate racial impact or a gender impact or whatever, you could be sued on a million grounds. But if it is part of a mass firing, what you call a reduction in force, if it's just like a mass firing, those actually fall outside the civil service rules as they exist. So if you go in that order to say that, okay, the Supreme Court's already told us that all of these regulations, not all of them, but an overwhelming majority of them are invalid. You go straight down that list and say we have 50%, 70%, 80% fewer regulations. Then you look at the 4 million people, civil servants or whatever, and say that, okay, if we have 80% fewer regulations, then we need 80% fewer people to enforce them. That simply makes sense. Then you have the industrial logic for right there under current law, mass downsizing just the scale of the federal government. And part of the problem is these things are deeply related. When you have a bunch of people who show up to work who should have never had that job in the first place, they start finding things to do, actually. And that's what gave us that regulatory morass in the first place, like the Federal Reserve. I mean, if you just fired, about 22,000 employees in the Federal Reserve, if you fired 90% of them, there would still be 2,000 left, which is arguably on the high side if you have a Federal Reserve whose sole focus is restoring the stability of the U.S. dollar, which I do think should be the sole mandate and sole purpose of the U.S. Fed.
So Christmas is coming and winter is coming, and that's the perfect combination for Cozy Earth. Cozy Earth is a company that makes exactly what it sounds like, products that are close to the earth and that are quite cozy. And you should consider them this Christmas. They have the best sheets available. They're made out of bamboo, believe it or not. And it's hard to believe how great they are until you try them. We have, and they are great. They're a great fit for everybody in your shopping list. What sets them apart? Well, their fabrics are temperature regulating. That means they keep you cool and cozy, or warm and cozy, depending on the temperature. And they have a 10-year warranty. So if anything goes wrong with your sheets, you get free ones. Go to cozyearth.com/Tucker. Use our promo code Tucker for up to 40% off. And if they ask, tell them the Tucker Carlson Show sent you. Everyone here uses those sheets and loves them.
Same thing with respect to, you go straight down the list. EPA,
what else
SEC,
what do
FTC.
22,000 employees do at the Fed?
Oh, they do a lot of calculations. They do a lot of conjecture, and it feeds their hubris a little bit. So markets, and I worked at a hedge fund. That was the first job I had for 7 years out of college, and, understand the way in which people will huddle around divining what the exact meaning is of a comma at the end of Federal Reserve minutes. Does that mean that they think that the economy's overheating so much that they have to raise interest rates? That feeds the kind of hubris of the bureaucrat to make them think that there's some kind of genius and some kind of actual savant that merits this attention. But the reason the market actors pay attention to what these Federal Reserve people say is not because they have some sort of expert knowledge that's actually meaningful. They're actually looking to see effectively how they're going to screw it up in the process, right? And so academics took over the Federal Reserve in the late 1990s.
But the Fed only has one big lever, right?
Well, they have a few levers actually they're able to pull. Yeah. I mean, just one big lever broadly means how much money you feed in or suck out of the system.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's true, but they've used that in ways that have been, I think, badly destructive to the country. I mean, because here's like an example of how. So when the academics took over the Fed in the late 1990s, like one of the things that happened, and this was a kind of managerial class in this agency, and that's a three-letter agency in some form, the FED, right? What they said was, okay, if wages are going up, this is a long story if you want to get into this, but we can give you a short version. If wages are going up, that is a leading indicator of inflation. So wage growth was a bad thing. So the way you fight wage growth is by tightening monetary policy into wages going up. Here's the problem with that. And anybody who's run a business knows this, okay? Wages are generally the last thing to go up in the business cycle. If things are going really well in the business cycle, the last thing most employers want to say, I'm not saying it's the right decision or the wrong decision, but most employers, the last thing they want to have go up is the wages. So wages tend to be actually not a leading indicator of the business cycle. Wage growth tends to be a trailing indicator of the business cycle. But you have the academic mindset of the Federal Reserve that said, that's one thing we can measure, that we can observe and feel smart about. So wage growth, we're going to treat that as a leading indicator of inflation, even when it's a trailing indicator. Well, what does that mean? They tighten monetary policy precisely into a natural downturn of the business cycle, which gives you the boom bust. And then what comes after a bust is of course, the bailout. So you get these boom bust bailout cycles. That's exactly what happened. You could say in 2000, you could see it in 2008. You could see some version of it, even in 2023, although that was a little bit more subtle. And so anyway, that's a whole rabbit hole about the Fed, but it's an example of when you have 23,000 people show up to work who should have never had the job in the first place. They start finding things to do. And when you find things to do, that ends up being destructive rather than helpful, which means the root cause is you got to get rid of the presence of the people who populate that bureaucracy. But in order to do that, you need this industrial logic. And that industrial logic, in my opinion, is what the Supreme Court has already given us, which is this mandate to say the executive branch, the fake executive branch, the administrative state, has written all these rules by fiat. Most of them are illegal. Like they're actually unlawful. They're illegitimate. And so if you have an executive branch that says, okay, we're going to recognize that most of these regulations are illegitimate, there's your blueprint for then shaving down the size of the federal bureaucracy, which is then the permanent solution to stop that bureaucracy from perpetuating this kind of illegal rampant action. And I think that's the stuff of how you actually save a country. Boring as that might sound.
It's not boring. And I think I've never heard in all the, my whole life in Washington, anybody suggest that this is a process that could really be stalled or reversed. The process being the growth of the federal government, which is just inexorable because the purpose of the institution is to protect itself and expand. That's the
like a law of physics applied to this government.
Every institution exists to protect itself for its own benefit. That's its purpose. And it's demonstrable in its behavior. So, but it's so obvious, it's so overwhelming. It's the largest institution in human history. I've never heard anybody say, we have a shot of like lopping off 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, like
80%. Yeah.
That would change everything from our foreign policy to our economy to our culture. You really think that could happen?
Yeah, I think it could happen. I think there'll be trade-offs. I'm not going to paint some sort of exclusively fake
one of the trade-offs is going to be you're going to have a crash in the economy of Arlington, Virginia, which is well-deserved.
And maybe a boom of the economy elsewhere.
And long overdue.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't Arlington and McLean and Loudoun County share the pain of Gary, Indiana? I don't understand. Or Springfield, Ohio. I don't understand that.
I actually going to take the bright side of this.
Sorry. I'm taking the apocalyptic side.
I'm in the golden age mood right now.
Yeah, no, sorry.
We're entering the golden age, but
you can feel the resentment.
It's two sides of the same coin, though. They go right together.
Yeah.
Send these people to Gary, Indiana, or to Springfield.
Yeah.
We don't need external individuals to the nation to actually fill those open positions. We have 3 million of them sitting in the greater Washington, D.C. area who, they could say, well, are those people really going to do those jobs? Maybe they should. Actually, they could be far more productive than the destruction that they're doing to the country right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. We hope you'll subscribe to it. And by the way, you can hit the little bell on there and get notifications every time we produce a video. We hope you'll do that also.